Russia's occupation of Crimea and Ukraine is still one of the leading issues here in a spring like Brussels. And things are really building up with a referendum in Crimea about independence from Ukraine and a meeting of EU foreign ministers on Monday to discuss further sanctions against Russia. Well, I'm joined by our Brussels Bureau Chief, Peter Spiegel. Peter, Europe perhaps surprised us last week with its announcement of sanctions against Russia. We have a meeting on Monday. What can we expect?
Well, the question now is the follow-through. There is a big debate here, and will happen through the weekend, over how far they're going to go with what's called stage 2 of the sanctions, which is who to target specifically with travel bans and asset freezes. And the debate is really between sort of, I guess we would say, the softies, the Italians and the Spanish leading this camp, which is let's focus very much on the Crimeans. You know, the Crimeans who overthrew the proper Ukrainian officials, the Russians on the ground in Crimea. Let's limit it to that. You have the Scandinavians, the Nordics, the Brits even, who are pushing for a much broader list of names to go all the way to Moscow and potentially even to Vladimir Putin's inner circle. So the question is going to be, when the ministers meet, where does that list go? Does it go all the way to Moscow, or do they limit it very focused on those in Crimea who are affecting things on the ground right now? That's
going to be quite a heated battle because there are quite a lot of interests conflicting here.
It is, and it's both political, geopolitically, but also, let's remember, economic. And one of the complaints you hear here in Brussels is you have the Americans being very, very bellicose and pushing very hard for sanctions. But all very well and good for the Americans to do that. They don't have the kind of economic interest that the Europeans have. Not just energy. We all know about energy. You know, some countries in Eastern Europe in particular get 80–90% of their energy resources from Russia, so a cutoff in gas in particular is going to hit them very hard. But let's remember financial resources as well. The City of London has very tight connections with Russian banks, with Russian investors. There are other trade links to Italy, to Spain that could really hit very hard to the level that the Americans just won't experience if they have sanctions.
Now, that's one level of sanctions, but I mean, is there a possibility that sanctions could go much, much further if circumstances change?
Yeah, and that's going to be the big debate actually for later in the week. On Thursday, we actually have the heads of state and government, the prime ministers, the presidents, coming to Brussels for one of their normally scheduled summits, but it's been completely taken over by the Ukraine events. And this is what's going to be called phase 3. Do they go for full-bore energy, trade, financial, arms embargo, full swath of sort of Iran-style sanctions against Russia? There are those who are pushing for that, and there are questions about what would trigger that. Is their failure to de-escalate in Crimea going to be the trigger, that they don't pull their troops back to their bases? Is that enough? Is it escalating the conflict in Crimea? Is it escalating it to other parts of Ukraine? What is that trigger? And that's going to be the fight that moves to Thursday, this phase 3 sanctions. What should they include, and what is the trigger? And that's where the debate is going to move over the course of the next week.
An unfair question, but crystal ball gazing, what's your prediction on that meeting on Thursday?
My prediction is they'll go pretty far on phase 2. I think they might go all the way to Moscow for the asset freezes and for the travel bans. But I think on phase 3, they're going to hold fire. I think what they're going to say is, unless the Russians really stir the pot in Crimea, we're almost happy is the wrong word, but we're content to let things stand as they are. It is only if we see an invasion into eastern Ukraine, into some of the other parts of the Russian-speaking bits of Ukraine, that I think you see these full swath of sanctions, because of the economic hit Europe could really take if there's backlash from the Russians on energy and on finance.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Peter. Well, if you want to follow more news and analysis about what's happening in Ukraine and also these debates in Brussels over the next week, very important debates, please go to ft.com/Ukraine.